kick it off by, Lindsay, let's start with you. Tell us just briefly about what's going on at the Inside. What's happening in PR?
So thank you for having me. So the Inside is a direct-to-consumer furniture company. So essentially, we offer a curated assortment of furniture frames, and you can customize and personalize them across 100 plus different fabrics. So we launched out of beta in July 2018, so just over a year old. And have explored a lot of different PR strategies. And so I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about them all with you.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Mallory, Small Girls PR. Has everyone heard of Small Girls PR? Yes, Mallory's one of our favorite speakers, so we're glad to have you again.
I love coming here. It's kind of sick. I love being around builders like you guys. I know a lot of people here are like seed stage, Series A, or like just thinking about starting your startup. And I identify with that because I guess I still have a startup technically. I started Small Girls when I was 21. I'm 31 now. I don't know what classifies as a startup anymore. We have like over 60 people. But anyway, so I identify as like the entrepreneurial yada yada. We do the things you think of when you think of public relations. A lot of things we'll be talking about on this panel tonight. Coming up with storytelling for media, but then also some of the fun out-of-the-box stuff that you might not think of, like experiential and doing 1,000-person block parties for Sweet Green or 25-person industry analyst dinners for GE for an oil and gas merger or whatever it might be. We've launched a bunch of brands, including some you might have heard of, Hinge, Glam Squad, Billy, the Tia Clinic, etc. And I am just jazzed to be here speaking with all of you tonight.
Thanks, Mallory. Michelle.
Cool. Hi. I'm Michelle. I work at Row. We're a patient-driven healthcare company. We use technology to make it really easy to connect with doctors from diagnosis to delivery. Right now, we have 3 digital clinics. We have a men's health clinic called Roman. If you watch the World Series, you've probably seen 1,000 commercials from us. We also have a digital clinic for women's health called Rory, and a clinic that's helping people with addiction called Zero, starting with smoking cessation.
Thanks. Tell us a little bit about how you define PR at Row.
Yeah, so for us, PR is the strategic spreading of communications to the public. I think a lot of people think of PR and they think of like TechCrunch articles, but there's so much more to really thinking. You have own media, like what you can put out on your own Medium posts and promote that way. You have your social channels for your brand and for your founders to be thought leaders. So we package all of that with earned media.
And do you think, Lindsay, that it's the same as marketing? How does PR versus marketing kind of get positioned at the Inside?
Yeah, I think it's a function of marketing. So you should definitely think about it holistically. And PR is a very kind of top of funnel vehicle, but a lot of the assets that you garner from PR, whether that's quotes from media or what have you, can be used in other marketing channels. So for instance, if you're included in an article in Vogue, you can then take that quote and put it in a paid social ad, and so or in your email communication. So it all really works together, and all the messaging should really speak to one another. And it's going to be slightly nuanced, but it should all be working towards the same goal. So PR is really a function of marketing. It's like a small subset, but as you mentioned, it's really, you need to think about it as like all external communications. And that includes everything from like what's in your email signature to your social pages to like what you're saying to journalists.
Before we came on, you were talking about how kind of marketing is fairly distributed at the Inside. And so I was wondering if you could, because you're 10 people here, and how do the positions of kind of PR responsibilities or marketing responsibilities get distributed?
Yeah, so I mean, we really think of it as kind of like top of funnel and kind of more bottom of funnel. So I handle a lot of top of funnel, and just because we're still pre-Series A, we're just doing things very nimbly, as I'm sure many, if not all of you, can attest. So I'm handling everything from PR, which feeds into affiliate marketing at the top of funnel, which feeds into SEO, and then I work with partners who handle more kind of paid and email and things that are going to more directly impact conversion. So you can split. I've seen it split up many different ways. We're just very small right now, and so until we have the luxury of hiring a manager across all of those channels, that's me.
I just feel like this is an important decision that probably a lot of the people in the audience are thinking about right now. And do you kind of understand why you are, kind of the PR is leading this versus a marketing header, is leading this? Because I think that's an interesting decision and probably really important to the strategy.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, a lot of times I find it depends on the backgrounds of your co-founders or your founders. So one of our founders, Christiane Lemieux, she's like a celebrity in the interior design space. She's been, hosted a show on HGTV with Ellen DeGeneres. Like she's been on the Today Show countless times. Like she is a PR maven. And so she really understands the value of having somebody with a strong communications background. But at the same time, I come from a PR agency background, and I've worked with tons of founders who come from more of kind of like the analytical side. And so, you really could go at it either way. I think the value of bringing somebody in who has a strong PR background is that they can really think about like how the consumer is going to be perceiving the messages you're putting out into the world, rather than let's just do whatever's going to drive the biggest numbers out the gate, because those might not be the strategies you want to stick with long term. And then once those messages are out there, as we've learned through, mistakes that, we've even made ourselves, it's really hard to undo them.
Mallory, you've worked with a number of small companies, medium and large companies. Companies going out of the gate, how should they be thinking about PR? How can, do you have advice for founders on how to think about whether or not it should be important for specifically what they're doing?
Yeah. You only launch once. However, there is a trick to that, which I'll dive into as part 2. I say you only launch once because reporters love news, and there's nothing newer than a new company or a new product rollout or a new campaign or a new feature. But your company going to market is going to be the biggest news you'll ever have, right? There is a huge opportunity for you to do what's called an embargo. An embargo is a gentleman or woman's agreement between your brand and the media to agree, hey, yeah, I'm confirming I'm interested in the news and that I will uphold the published date of my potential coverage if you give me more information. So you could be like, hey, I've got a brand that's in stealth. It's in the fintech space. They're trying to be the good guys of credit. Would you like to know more about what that means? And if so, would you agree to the embargo? Then they're like, yeah, I agree to the embargo, down to learn more. And that's when you come up with the bullet points of like, what does this fintech company do? What does that mean? What will the product features be? What's the vision for the brand? All of the stuff that they wouldn't otherwise be able to know had they not agreed to that embargo. And you don't have to sweat that they're going to blow your launch because they're agreeing to only publish after your app or your site or whatever is actually live and can drive traffic back to downloads or opens or whatever. The part 2 to that is you can do like a soft launch of a feature or a company and have it out there, and maybe even have a botched launch where you got kind of crappy press, but in like really low tier blogs. What we've done as a trick is slap a beta sticker on it after the fact and then say, hey, we've been beta testing it. And then you can do your hard launch and reach out to media and be like, here's what we learned in the beta. That becomes new news. And by the way, like, do you agree to this embargo? We'll tell you what we learned in the beta. And then you can kind of have your like second hard launch. So that's my like long answer to how should you think about launching a product. It's like, try your damnedest the first time around. If it fails, don't worry. You can like maybe kind of relaunch it.
You can iterate forwards and backwards,
Yeah.
apparently. Michelle.
Yeah, no, I'd add on to that because like that's like agency trick, adding the beta tab. Like, oh man, like we've done that a million times. There's so much power in not going big with a PR launch and being able to iterate and do small tests where you don't have that footprint in the media and you can see like, okay, maybe this messaging isn't working. Maybe the customer you thought you were going after isn't who is interested in your product. And once you go live and have those articles about you, it's harder to like take a step back and pivot. So there is a lot of power in making sure that you can figure out your messaging and know who your customer is before you go out to the press.
Is that what you did at Row?
That is not what we did at Row.
And just
That's what I
elaborate.
did when I was
I do
in
want
my
to
agency
did
days.
you say this? You were the first employee at Row.
I was the first full-time employee, yeah. I didn't say it, but that's like my claim to fame.
A statement also about the role of PR and its importance at launch.
Yeah. So for that backstory, so when I was on the agency side and I knew I wanted to go in-house somewhere and I wasn't sure what was the right company for me. And when I got connected with the founders of Row, at the time it was just 3 co-founders and a consulting pharmacist. I was so impressed that their first full-time hire, they were thinking about hiring someone in PR. Like they just really seemed like founders who understood the value of PR. And for me, Row, I loved Row because it was very polarizing. When I first joined, we were coming out with our first digital clinic, Roman. We were only coming out with one condition. It was erectile dysfunction medication. So everyone always had really strong reactions to that. And I loved like working on something very polarizing. But your question was how I became the first person there. It's because one of our angel investors was the founder of Casper, and that's the approach that they took. So Casper's first hire was comms, and Casper was like a mattress that came in a box. We were coming out with an easy way to get Viagra. There's like 1,000 ways that could have gone wrong without education and messaging. And when we launched, like our story was about educating people that having ED could be a sign of an underlying condition like heart disease, diabetes, and our CEO was very open about his own journey with experiencing ED and how it was the first sign of a heart condition. So we just spelled it out from the rooftops, and every single story we told was about educating so we could completely control that message.
So it was less about a product launch or a company launch and more about a messaging launch, or?
I mean, both. We wanted when people thought about our company to think about educating in healthcare and not e-commerce. It was very important to us to stamp ourselves as a healthcare company because this was our like MVP, right? Roman with one condition. This whole time we knew we wanted to be this amazing best-in-class telemedicine platform that was everyone's, doctor in their pocket, basically. But we couldn't go wide in the beginning. We had to start with one condition and really offer the best service possible to that. So it was really communicating that from the start and not pigeonhole ourselves as like an ED startup.
Yeah. I want to come back to the exact launch, or how you kind of launched the messaging in a few minutes. And I want to go back to Lindsay. Before you joined, you said you launched in 2018 and you joined about 6 months ago. What was going on in PR? What did you inherit from this founding team when you joined?
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, our founders were kind of very fluent in PR, which was a blessing, to come into that environment. At the time when I joined, they were working with an agency, just given that they didn't have the kind of full-time capabilities to be managing that function. But the agency was focused specifically on interiors and like the home space, so like Elle decor and like very kind of niche publications. And we were ready for something new. We had raised a seed round, and like the business the story needed to be it first needed to be established and needed to be told. And so, branching into kind of like a broader lifestyle message or a broader investor message, like the agency they were working with, that just wasn't their bread and butter. And so when I joined about 6 months ago, kind of my role was really just to establish processes and like take stock of what we had and where we wanted to go. And similar to your point, when we launched, we didn't kind of have I wasn't with the team at the time, and so we didn't really have the luxury of like really thinking through the messaging we wanted to go live with. And some of it came back to bite us in that when we launched, we went out with a message of we're fast furniture. And we realized quickly that that is a very like Zara messaging and like fast fashion, when really we're actually one of the most sustainable offerings out there because we don't hold inventory, we don't produce water or waste because everything's digitally printed and made on demand. And that's really important to one of our founders because she comes from Wayfair. And so we quickly realized that when the Fast Company article says the next fast furniture, brand is launching, that follows you forever, and it still follows us. And so when you Google us, like, it's hard to push that down in the search rankings. And so when I joined, it was really kind of like rethinking what we wanted to go to market with. And how we could really tell a story that felt more authentic to us and not just like so clickbaity. So that was kind of the first process, was like really putting messaging in place, working with our co-founders to figure out what was authentic to them. And I think that's a really important story. And it kind of nods to your earlier point about figuring out a personal connection to the brand. Because when you think about your favorite brands, like Away, for instance, they talk about how, she was running through the airport and her luggage broke and she like couldn't get it back together and she was late for her flight and all of that. And that sticks with you. And so to think about what your connection is, as long as it feels authentic to you, that's what someone's going to walk away with. And whether it's an investor or a reporter or a consumer, they're going to remember that, and then they're going to feel that connection. And so it was thinking through what that was for us. And then bringing it to market. And so we had to think about what our audiences were, whether we were, prioritizing investors or, general consumers, and of those consumers, who, and that really informs how you're going to tell your story. So I'd say the building blocks were very, very, very important. And that's what I did for probably the first 2 months of my role.
I think that actually the point about investors being a marketing or PR target is a really important one, and often doesn't come out at the panels. But if that's part of your path and basically something you're going to do every 1 to 2 years, then yes, how you speak to investors from a PR perspective is.
And it's a totally different set of messaging, right? Like, it's not the same messaging you're going to speak to Refinery 29 with. And, we speak to both audiences. So when we meet with, somebody at Fortune or somebody at TechCrunch or, even at a trade publication, like, you really need to think about how your message differs, because it's a completely different reader and a completely different intended audience. So you really need to think about, like, people always say like, oh, well, I want to be on the Today Show. And it's like, well, like, if you're on the 10 a.m. hour of the Today Show, like, is your audience 65-year-olds? Because otherwise it's probably not, it might move the needle very temporarily, but for the effort to put into something like that, you're probably better off speaking to a little bit more of a focused audience. Don't get me wrong, Today's Show segment is great, but you really need to think about who your intended audience is.
Yeah. Mallory, when you and your team start working with a client, what is kind of the storytelling process? How do you go about figuring out what's newsworthy about them, or isn't, for that matter?
Yeah, so I just spoke a little bit about hard news and defining what that is, and it could be, a key hire, a fundraise, a product rollout, whatever. But for the most part, there will be periods in the life cycle of a lot of companies where you don't have any hard news. And I think the challenge and the reward of PR is being able to make news when there isn't any news. And there's a lot of fun ways to do that, that could range from the stuntier and cheekier to the more analytical, like pulling data out of your back end and being able to trend forecast or tell stories. So as an example, we do them with so many. I'm going to try and pick one. Okay, so we work with ThreadUp, which is a player in the resale consignment space. And every single year, we create the annual resale report, where we look at all of their data and the brands that people are buying and uploading to sell and purge their closets of the most in any given time period, what's happening in pop culture at that same time period. So for example, if Marie Kondo is trending on Netflix, is Threadflip all of a sudden seeing a flip where people are uploading more than they're buying at that particular given moment? During the inauguration we did for Trump, we did a look into Ivanka Trump branded clothing and how the political cycle would impact whether people were purging or purchasing depending on the state they lived in and how people voted in that particular cycle. And that's really interesting because when you think about comms, you also have to think about who is your customer. Is it a 65-year-old that's watching the Today Show? Is it a person who lives in a state that voted for Trump and might be upset by us calling something the Ivanka Trump purge surge? I don't know. So the way that we thought about this was not only coming up with the idea, but then also how do you message that idea to not offend anyone and treat it as straight, impartial, neutral news and be able to just say, this is the state of our country. Here's what's happening in different states. ThreadUp is not, we also worked with a brand called ThreadFlip. ThreadUp is not actually making a political statement. They're just providing data and commentary on what is happening with consumer behavior. So that's an example of making news when there would have been no hard news.
I do want to ask, so that whether Small Girls PR or the company itself, ThreadUp is producing the data. It seems like like a lot of work to pull it together. And so when you're doing this, like who is the target? What kind of news are you trying to get? How do you how did you know that, or what kind of gave you the hunch that this would be effective for the news media and not just, a possible way to look at data interestingly?
Yeah. One lens that's really easy is like proving or disproving commonly held beliefs. So proving that people who voted for Hillary Clinton would be really quick to offload their Ivanka Trump branded clothing, for example, or disproving it and saying there's these like closeted, I guess, literally, in this case, we're talking about clothes going in the closet, people who love Ivanka Trump that actually are in New York State, even though that wasn't as likely of a story. So being able to prove or disprove things, I think, is something that we're thinking about for media bait, if you will. Being able to establish a story that's never been told before, no one else had told that story, and it's ownable to ThreadUp. Being able to comment on what's happening in the world through the lens of your particular company. How can your company predict or defend what's happening in popular culture and be a part of that narrative? Or creating a world's first. So like at the time that we started doing the ThreadUp resale report, I believe we were the first brand to actually be doing a stake in the ground around the trends of sustainability and the circular economy and thinking about things like that. So all of those narratives.
And I feel like I would love for you to bring up, you were talking about being somewhat neutral in a way that you weren't offending anyone, but you told a story at a previous panel a year ago or so where ThreadUp was not so shy about being aggressive.
Yes. So they will be aggressive on the values that they believe in. And I think that sounds like something that's probably pretty common with a lot of us here. Even though ThreadUp will not say, or has not to date said anything about one candidate versus the other, they will take a really hard stance on sustainability. So they are just on the side of sustainability. And we had seen that Burberry had put out an earning report where they talked about burning all of their excess inventory in order to maintain and their market share and not dilute the value of their products because they didn't want them going to a secondhand marketplace. And I have no idea why one of my staff members was reading Burberry's earning report. This was not in the news at the time, but she was like, oh my God, like this is terrible. They're touting this as something they're really proud of. I feel like one of our brands, like ThreadUp, who really cares about sustainability, should provide expert opinion on this or do something. So we did an emergency brainstorm and we came up with this idea of #BurnBerry. And we created a campaign where all ThreadUp did was pen a really simple open letter that we wrote and put on their socials and said like, hey, Burberry, we saw that you're doing this. We want to bring attention to it. Here's all the reasons that it's bad for the environment. Fast fashion is the only industry second to oil that pollutes the environment at the scale and rate that it does. We want to partner with you and offload the carbon footprint of you creating excess inventory and burning all this merchandise and donate all the sales that happen on ThreadUp with your excess inventory to an eco-friendly charity. And all we did was we put that on socials, we emailed it around to affinity brands, because other brands can be a media outlet for you. Other brands that care about sustainability in this case, we were banking on caring about this enough to share on their social channels as well. And then, of course, did an embargo with media and got a lot of people that care about sustainability and maybe not even so much just fashion, but in general held this as a core value of their own, of their publication, and we still get cited for this. And Burberry actually had to issue a reaction and has stopped doing the practice. And ThreadUp constantly gets cited as one of the reasons why.
Michelle, how do you think of storytelling, on an average day at Row or the Inside when you're not launching something new?
Yeah, so we have very very core values that we think about in terms of all our stories. Right now, we think of, okay, does this help us talk about how we provide safety to patients, how we provide access to patients, how we provide transparency to patients? We think about it under that lens. Does this talk about the innovation of our technology? And if a story doesn't hit one of those buckets, it's probably not a fit for right now, because that's where our building blocks are. So it's easy for us to say no to stories or inbounds from media that come in that don't fit those guidelines, because we only have so much time and energy from our executives. So we can be laser focused on stories that help us with that mission. And we can kind of iterate as we go. So like right now, it's important to us to get in front of more, medical doctors. So we're prioritizing those stories rather than some of the consumer stuff.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process or operations of finding a story? Do you sit around a table and brainstorm, or
Yeah.
how does it work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think right now we're really excited because we've built all our own technology, so we have lots of rich data about patients. So right now we're really diving into our data to tell compelling stories. So we'll look at trending research articles or pieces where we can say something a little bit different from what the research article was saying. There's lots of articles right now talking about how telemedicine isn't safe, how all these other things, and we're able to speak to our dissenters with data and tell really compelling stories that are interesting, but also help that narrative.
What about at the Inside?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really easy to kind of get in this mode, especially when you're a young company and you're excited to just like say yes to everything. And I think it can be really exhausting, especially because it is very time consuming. So I think that's spot on, and that you really need to pick a couple of lanes that are going to move the needle and a couple of audiences you want to speak to and go all in. And if that's a trade focused audience and you're targeting medical publications that aren't necessarily like the sexy headlines, that may at the end of the day actually move the needle a lot more for you. So at the Inside, I mean, we have been really focused to date. Previously, we were kind of more focused on a business audience, and now we're really focused around the holidays. Given the seasonality of it, on things like gift guides. So again, it really just depends on the industry you're in and what the consumer behavior is that you're hoping to impact. And I think paying attention to kind of just like the really basic things, like if back to school is a big moment for you, or I don't know if home buying season or tax season or whatever it may be, and kind of planning campaigns around those pillar moments will really help your strategy kind of take shape. And then you can those will be kind of the filler moments in between things like launches, et cetera, fundraisers. But another thing to think about is that it's not just pitching media. Part of a PR strategy is also thinking about like speaking opportunities and events and awards. So thinking about being at the right conferences and getting your founders in front of the right audiences there, or whether that's something like Fast Company's Most Innovative Companies Award is always a big one every year. So thinking about those things as well is important. It's not all just kind of media conversations, but it's really that holistic package.
Would you say that stack list is a core part of your strategy?
Exactly. I mean, this is us doing PR for our companies right now. So it's really like you're never like, you really have to think about who you're, for instance, like if one of your big goals right now is recruiting, then you might want to send somebody on your team to speak and you are thinking specifically about recruiting developers. Then you might want to send somebody on your team to speak at a developer conference. And so, that doesn't necessarily mean media is going to be there. But again, in any PR strategy, like you have to really think about the end audience. And if you're asked to speak at a developer conference and your goal is not recruiting developers, then, even though it seems great and like you want to put as many opportunities in front of your team as possible, probably not the best use of your time, especially when you're stretched so thin as it is.
I think there's a really important point here too, which is PR can sometimes be a hammer for things that aren't even nails. So when you think about recruiting, or you think about I don't know, fundraising, whatever, like PR can often solve those problems in atypical ways. One example of that is we worked with Hinge for the past 7 years, so like launch through acquisition by Match Group, and they were struggling to fill this role that was around like data science and engineering. And they mentioned it offhand on a call, and we did a quick brainstorm and came up with this idea of like, how could we get press for this role? Like, how do you get press for just like a data scientist role? Probably pretty unlikely, at least at like top tier publications. So we came up with this idea of how to make it PRable. And we were like, what if this role really spoke to Hinge's core values of making successful matches and just getting people off the app right away? That's actually the opposite of typical technology roles where like you want to get as many users as possible using your app for as long as possible. But this role is to get people to look at the app for less than 5 minutes and leave and hopefully delete the app because it's so successful, because you're not looking for matches anymore. So we rebranded it and asked them to change the title to be anti-retention specialist. And we ended up getting a ton of coverage for this, where we got like CNBC and CNN, and people were like, what's an anti-retention specialist? And all of a sudden, tons of people applying for this role. Whereas like really at the end of the day, it was a pretty typical technology role, but we positioned it to show how it had strong messaging pull through, and Hinge was really putting their money where their mouth was when they think about what they want their talent to do.
Michelle, you were gonna.
Oh no, we've just gone through so many phases at Row where we had goals to hit different audiences. So like when we launch a new brand, a lot of times it will be grabbing consumers. So a plan for us would be, okay, we need to make sure that we have a feature article with a great headline that has very clear links to our website so that we can promote this on social. When we were coming out with one of our newer brands and it has no footprint on SEO and no footprint on Google, we have a separate plan of, okay, we need lots of little links to improve the domain authority. So we're going to have our medical experts speak to lots of different little like bustle, refining 29 small opportunities that we can aggregate pretty quickly and improve the domain authority so that we rank higher. When we wanted to, talk to investors, we're like, okay, we need to show growth. We need to have actionable examples in the press so that we can point to those. So each of those is a goal. You can't do all of that at once. Like you really need a goal or you're going to go crazy. But like understanding what the goal of the PR is, like PR for PR's sake is just like a waste of time, and you won't be able to measure if it's working. So really understanding what our goal is per quarter or per month is very helpful for us.
Please talk a little bit more about measuring outcomes of PR.
Yeah, so I think it depends. We're very analytically driven. I'm also, because I'm in-house, I have access to Google Analytics. So one way I would measure it is like physically seeing, okay, did this article actually drive clicks? Granted, like how many of you read an article and actually click the name of the brand that you're reading about? Like it's not a perfect way to measure, but we can use it for growth marketing and see if that drives traffic. So we can measure it that way. We can also measure it by like who's sharing it, who's talking about it. We have 200 employees now. We'll know when someone sees an article organically because they'll forward it around and be like, oh my God, look, we're in this. So like that has its own value too, and people stumble upon your coverage, and it's very exciting rather than you kind of shoving it to them.
Would you say there's rigor? I say that non-judgmentally, but is it like a rigorous data process of determining whether, or is it a rigorous process of setting benchmarks for like the success of an article? Or
no, I mean it can't be because that's like it's so fluid. It's just one
you
other
say
way.
It can't be, but I think that that's probably a struggle of a lot of people in PR is being like the demand for proof. And I happen to agree, just in my experience, that's kind of a futile and you're thinking about it the wrong way. But I think it is tempting to look for validation in the numbers. If
your goal is like, okay, I want to be able to put 3 logos on my website to build credibility, that can be your way to measure. Do you have those logos and clickable articles to build that brand? So measuring is also relative on what you're measuring. If you're measuring, I want like 15% of my revenue to come from articles, that's super unrealistic.
Yeah.
Like that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think like, for instance, today, we had an article that ran in print in the New York Post, and like there's no way of judging the success of something like that, similar to a broadcast hit or like a Wall Street Journal hit or speaking at a conference or whatever. But then we had somebody call us on our customer service line and say, I read your article today, like, how can I buy a sofa? And like, that's music to our ears. And it further reinforces that there's not always and most of the time going to be a clear path, because I think one of our, a competitor did a study that a customer needs something like, especially in our space, like 7 touch points with a brand before they're going to convert on something. So maybe
especially in our space, like furniture or
in
considered
home,
purchase.
I mean, in e-commerce in general, but
Okay.
specifically in home. But something like they might see a paid ad on Instagram and then read an article and then hear their friend talk about it and then read another article and then go back to the site and then receive an email and then finally convert. And so I think it can be really tricky, especially coming from the agency world. I mean, I used to work on tons of clients who, especially if you're working with a CMO or a founder that has a very analytical background, it can be really hard and kind of feel like you're talking in circles sometimes if they're asking you to directly show to their board, for instance, justify the investment of this agency spend. And I totally get that. But at the same time, you have to kind of show up both qualitatively and quantitatively. And I would say if you're working with an agency or an in-house person and you're asking them for metrics, I would say be wary of kind of like what I call the fluff metrics. And I'm sure you can speak to this well
say
too.
UMV.
Yes.
Of course not. She can't.
Yeah, like
Not
Unique
fluff.
monthly
no, I mean
visitors.
just kind of the UVM or the impressions, where it's like this. I think if you were to look up the impressions of Yahoo, I think it says they have like something like 23 billion impressions, like
Meanwhile,
more
8
than there's
people
even
read it.
more people on the earth. And yeah, meanwhile, like I don't even know if anyone reads that anymore. And so it can be really easy to get sucked into this like false kind of like reporting structure. And you really need to think about it both qualitatively and quantitatively. So Google Analytics is a great resource to get started in that. So if you had something go live in the New York Post and you see a huge bump in direct traffic, you can maybe make a correlation that like people are just going direct to the site. But it really needs to be this holistic thing that you're thinking of it. And for instance, like my example earlier, maybe that Vogue article didn't drive that many clicks to the site, but you used it on paid social, and for whatever reason, like the Vogue kind of like the vote of confidence from Vogue drove so many click-throughs on that paid ad that like that alone was worth it. Or same with email. We used a targeted email where we, to interior designers, where we said El Decor loves us or something like that. And that drove so much conversion because that is like a very trusted source for them. So I think you just have to think about it in a lot of different ways. And if you're just looking at PR with kind of one set in stone metric, it's probably not going to look like it's working for you.
When do you hire a PR firm?
Oh, I mean, I think, coming from agency life, I really think there's a lot of value in working with an incredible agency. I tried to work with small girls and they were just too busy. So I would say that is like, top notch.
This is one of the only places you can get access to the brilliance of small girls PR.
Seriously, it doesn't come cheap. No, but I mean, I think it really depends. So agencies obviously aren't cheap, and you kind of get what you pay for. So I would be really careful in thinking about, especially if you're still kind of like, pre-launch per se, thinking about bringing on an agency, because what I found being on the other side of it and working with co-founders or founders is that, because you're as an agency member, you're one layer removed, you really need somebody on the inside who can give you what you need to succeed. And if you as a founder are stretched so thin that you don't have the time to help an agency succeed, they're not going to be successful. And you can't expect them to just like come up with all these assets, whether that's creative assets or messaging workshops or like getting time with the founder to talk to media. They're not going to be successful. So if you're not at a point where you can either manage them yourself because you have somewhat of a background in communications, or assign somebody on your team who's at least somewhat well-versed in PR to manage them, I just don't think it's worth the investment. And I think you'll be disappointed because they're not going to be able to, they're not set up to succeed in that way. So I think that's my experience being on the other end. We haven't hired an agency because we were at a point where we had so much internal legwork to do first to really figure out what we needed in an agency. And there's agencies, like I said, for fintech. There's agencies that specialize in healthcare or home decor, or agencies that like Small Girls are more generalists and focus on a lot of growth brands. But it's really figuring out what you need, and it's an expensive investment if you're not sure if you're ready or if you have the time.
I want to make sure we also talk about forming relationships with journalists. Mallory, any advice that you have for founders in the room who might not have a PR might not have PR representation? How can they?
So I do recognize like the benefit I have that I represent a lot of brands. So it's a lot easier for me to like even from scratch be like, hey, person I've never met before, would you like to get coffee? Like whatever. So as a founder of like a single, industry brand, if you will, what value can you provide? Ask yourself that question first. Like, what value could I provide to this reporter? What am I an expert on? Or like, what does my data show? And how can I leverage that as a reason to provide value to them in an in-person or phone conversation? I would also like maybe make yourself like a little list of like 10 reporters that you feel like really understand the industry you're in, and we'll call them your beat reporters, and follow what they're working on and what they're talking about, and spot trends and patterns. And I know you're like, oh my God, I'm such a busy founder. How am I going to do this? This is if you don't have an agency, because then they should be doing this for you, ostensibly. Or a lovely in-house person would be doing this on your behalf as well and taking it off your plate. But follow their beat and like interact with them on Twitter or on Instagram or on email, not all at once, not every day, but start building the relationship that way and having an educated conversation with them and acting as a source before they're even asking you to.
I think give before you take is like a really good way to approach that. Like when I work with early stage founders, sometimes we would say like, okay, follow the reporters that you're interested in. And if you earnestly read the article and found it of value, when you retweet it, like add something to that. Like maybe it was about like the future of AI and you could be like, love this piece from so-and-so. Like, I think it's interesting that blah, blah, blah. And they'll see you as like having interesting insights on there and like slowly building that skill as an expert. And you're not like outright pitching them being like, I read your article. Like they must get 1,000 of those a day, but slowly kind of seeding that and really picking those 10 people that you want to build that relationship with and go about it that way. When they see your name in your inbox later, maybe they'll be like, oh, I think I saw that person tweet about me.
And their job is content, so they want you to be the person bringing their next interesting story to them.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think too, really quickly, like something to emphasize that I hear a lot, and I'm not sure how true the stat is, but I would believe it, that there's 6 PR people for every journalist. And so that should put things in perspective for you. And that wasn't the way things were 5, 10, 15 years ago. I mean, you all probably see the way media is going. It's like there's, one person, like for instance, one person at Refinery 29 is now responsible for writing roughly like 7 stories a day, not just writing them, but writing headlines, which used to be one person's job, promoting on social, which used to be one person's job. And so they're stretched so thin. We were speaking with a reporter at TechCrunch who said he receives roughly 250 to 300 PR pitches a day. And so how are you going to cut through that? I mean, that's why you hire great agencies and great in-house people who have existing relationships, because it's a lot like sales. And so how do you get somebody to open that email? And they've seen every trick in the book every day. So it's about trying to cut through. And like when you can empathize for the struggle that they have to try and distill what's valuable and what's not, they're so burnt out by the amount of emails that they get that you have to really create above and beyond value for them.
There's so much craft to the subject line. And like something that we did when we were pre-launch was I played it for our angel investors. So if you have like an angel investor or that came from a company that media have heard of, you can easily be like, why the founder of company invested in this something. And it's a really easy way to like throw a name in that reporter's inbox that they've heard of as a way for them to open that and read about you. So probably I also A/B test. Like don't have one subject line. Try out like 5 or 6. If you're creepy like me and you're okay with using tracking software, you can actually see when people are opening it, but like whatever, morality. But A/B test and see what people are responding to, and kind of figure that out.
It's funny because I feel like I'm tempted, like based on what everyone's saying, it's like there really is so much importance to like kind of creative, in-depth, sincere, substantive messaging and pursuing it with like those things in mind versus this like run hard, fail fast kind of mentality and volume is everything. But there is a balance because you're saying you're able to A/B test, so like, are you A/B
But
testing to like
even if you're A/B testing 4 subject lines
Yeah.
to 20 people,
Yeah.
it's not mass pitching. Like
Yeah.
if there's one takeaway I have here, it's please don't mail merge, please don't mass pitch, please personalize your emails. It's better to send out 20 personalized emails and 500 of the same mass pitch. Like I'm sure you guys agree. It's just like a waste of time, and then you end up getting into people's spam filter.
Are there tools that y'all find particularly helpful for running PR? Mallory, yeah.
Yeah, I love Muckrack.
I love Muckrack.
My
Me
team
too.
loves Muckrack.
I would
Like,
recommend them any day.
Yeah.
Over.
Do you want to explain what they are?
Yeah.
Has anyone heard of them?
If you've heard of Cision, it's like basically a better version, in my opinion.
We use both.
Yeah, I've used both. I've used pretty much all of them, and Cision owns so many of them
We're
at this
Muckrack
point.
only.
But yeah, I was Muckrack only at my last agency after we moved off Cision. But it's essentially it's a big database that has reporters and bloggers and from every outlet you can think of, large and small, has their contact information and like a little bit about them. And so it's basically like a big address book. And it's extremely helpful if you don't have the time to sit there and guess email addresses and wait for a bounce back to see if you got the right email address, which I'm doing now because we don't pay for Muckrack in-house, just because I have a lot of existing lists that I can pull off of and I pretty much know what people's addresses are. But a tool like that is extremely helpful, and the benefit of working with an agency is that they subscribe to all of those tools in-house and so, or in their agency, and so that's just usually built into your retainer fee.
Yeah, totally. And then also something that's really helpful, I think, for founders that's free and you can sign up right now, is Haro, which is Help a Reporter Out. And it's just a daily email. You can sign up for like one of probably over a dozen different types of lists that you might be relevant for. And it's basically just like a mass blast every morning of like, hey, there's these 20 stories reporters are working on in the healthcare and technology space, let's say. And then they'll say like, these are the types of expert opinions we need. If you can help a reporter out, like please email this address with what your expertise is, yada, yada, yada.
Anything that you use, Michelle?
I mean, they took my 2. I'd say the only third one I'd add is I think there's a lot of value in blogs like Medium where you can own your own narrative and create your own story, and it's free and you can own it. And maybe there's a story that you want to tell and no one's interested in. You can tell it yourself. Like you can also be the creator of your own destiny.
Do you use a blog Medium?
We don't. We have our own kind of like blog on our site that we use. It's more kind of design focused. But another trick that I think is worth mentioning, it's just kind of like a trick of the trade, is that something to realize is that if your goal is to be in, I don't know, the health section of the New York Times, I mean, lofty goal, but if that's your goal, then start thinking about where the health reporters at the New York Times are getting their news. And chances are they're reading a lot of the kind of trade publications and blogs that are established in that space. So it's almost like kind of a hacky way to like build your kind of foundational story up a bit. So if you work with, I don't know, Medical News Today, I'm just making it up. It sounds like a trade publication I've probably worked with at some point, or Modern Healthcare, for instance, and you tell your story to them, very reputable trade publication, and then they write a story on your company, and then you use that story to then pitch a reporter at the New York Times. It's almost like they trust that more because the legwork has been done for them, and a reputable kind of colleague of theirs has already told this story, and so there's clearly something to it. And so you can start small. If you don't have to just immediately start pitching the New York Times. You can start with people that maybe are a little bit more focused on your industry, probably don't get as many pitches as the New York Times health reporter, and you can work your way up. And that's, I've seen that work a lot, especially in more technical, like, in healthcare or fintech, where there's a lot of kind of like really established trade publications. And that's another way to go about it.
I do want to go back to the beginning of the conversation where we were talking about launches. So whether it's the launch of a company, the launch of a brand, the launch of a product, can we just go down the road and just provide some advice to the founders who are kind of on the cusp of a new brand, product, or all-out company? And Michelle, do you mind if we start with you?
Yeah, I think some advice. We've launched 3 digital health clinics, and something they all have in common is we focus on 2 things. We always illustrated the problem, used data to back that up, and then explain how we were tackling that problem in an interesting way. Paired with that, we always had a really interesting backstory, founding story. So those 2 elements together, we kind of hit it all in one package. So I'd say you can find that no matter what you're coming out with. You're obviously launching it because like we need it. And like what's interesting about why you're launching it, there's stuff to find. Sometimes I think what's helpful if you're not sure what your messaging story is, talk to someone like a friend about your company who doesn't know it that well and see what gets them excited, like what lights their face up. That's something that maybe you didn't know is as interesting and kind of like play in there.
It's a great idea. Mallory.
Yeah. Oh man, launch. So from the agency perspective, something that sadly happens a lot is I will get an email in my inbox like a month before someone's launch being like, hey, I'm launching in 3.5 weeks. Like, we're really looking for PR. Can you help? And I'm like, oh no, like would have potentially have loved to. First, if we have bandwidth, but 2, I would say like start thinking about your agency like way longer than you think you will need to, which is like 5 months before you launch, or 5 months before you launch that next huge milestone product that you really want to get right this time. Because we usually need at a minimum like 2.5 months to actually launch the brand appropriately. So that's the first thing I think of is just like timeline, because so much of the work that my lovely colleagues are talking about here is messaging and having to really craft that and hone in on what is your brand house. Like, what are all of the messaging pillars in your hierarchy of storytelling that ladder up into that? What are the things that you want to talk about and kind of set the stage for now so that you don't get pigeonholed into being the erectile dysfunction company, but you're actually a
Healthcare technology company.
that's what it is. So you're seeding that messaging now and kind of hinting at what the longer term vision is, and also making that distinction. Like, do you want to launch and say like, this is my product and stake in the ground now? Or do you want to say like, this is the first of many? And that's 2 very different decisions, and both are worth exploring. So yeah, there's a lot of upfront work to do. And then of course, curating the media, giving reporters enough time to consider the pitch, giving reporters enough time to be like, oh yeah, I can't talk to you for a week from now, and then I'll need a week to file my story. So that's like 2 weeks before your launch. And that's just thinking about the time the reporter gets back to your pitch. Hopefully that was clear.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you guys covered a lot of it. I would say really if PR is a goal if media is a goal for your launch, think about why ultimately it matters to the audience of the reporter you're pitching. Because I feel like so many reporters receive pitches where they're saying like, you should care about this. And this is why this is important. And like, this is like this, then they use a string of jargon, which I can't even begin to like think about probably the incredible, I mean, if you follow reporters, they do like horrible PR emails, they'll tweet screenshots and like my nightmare. And like, I would probably be a hermit if I was ever one of those, but they do it because they get so many. But instead think about like, why a reader of the New York Times health section should really care about this and like how it might impact them personally and what emotion you're probably trying to elicit from them. So, that's where kind of like the personal story and anecdote comes in, whether that's like a founder struggling with ED or whatever that is, and because the reporter ultimately cares about moving the needle for their readers and providing value and something newsworthy to them. So make sure you acknowledge that and think about how that message is going to be different. So you should really have kind of like a messaging hierarchy, not to use PR jargon, but like a couple of messages about like what you are as a company and what you stand for. But then within that, you're going to have messaging for the TechCrunch audience, messaging for the lifestyle audience, messaging for, an investor audience, whatever that may be, and really think about how you're going to, speak to each subset of reporters differently to acknowledge that, like, hey, listen, like, we know, like, we think your readers will be interested in this because X, not like, hey, this is the Uber for whatever it is. And like that, I feel like, just kind of being one of many and telling this is why you should care about us. So yeah.
A tip to add on to that, Twitter is a really good platform because reporters like bare their souls on there. You can really see, like you'll see, like maybe some reporters
I think a lot of people bear their souls on it.
Yeah, maybe some reporters always use lowercase. They never use capital letters. Maybe they're constantly, tweeting memes. Maybe they're always talking about dogs. Those are tricks that you can incorporate into your emails. If someone's really serious on Twitter, your pitch, like with a funny GIF, like might not go over as well. Where if someone's like always tweeting jokes and stuff and is more open to seeing that personality fit. Anyways.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to move to your questions, which I'm taking right here. The first one is, how do you de-rank bad PR? Not that any of you have ever had any bad PR, I'm sure, but some
Like
people
the Fast
have.
Company article?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and the thing is that that's not necessarily bad PR so much as it is just you not really being able to control the message. And so like I've been in so many interviews in my previous agency with clients where they say something and they don't even realize. I mean, this is also why you need it to work with either an agency or an in-house person. They don't even realize that they said it, and that becomes the headline. And so, really nothing is, I mean, this is kind of digressing, but nothing is ever off the record. Like, unless you work in the White House, like nothing is off the record. Don't ever let it's a really interesting example. But I mean, that's like it's really like the last frontier where people like use anonymous sources, and like that doesn't really happen so much. And if you're with a journalist and they say like, oh, this is just on background, or this is off the record, or in mid conversation, I've had founders say like, oh, and this is off the record, but like we're slated to do X in revenue this year, and then they printed in the story, and the founder's like, well, I thought it was off the record, and it's like there was no agreement. And even if you agree, if the reporter feels that news is newsworthy enough to print, and they're willing to like you lose your goodwill in that, like they will. And that's their job. So
once it's out there, what choices, like as far as like de-rank it, is it just bury it with good stuff? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's you can't ignore it. You kind of have to acknowledge it, but
I mean, if the headline's not terrible and the first paragraph isn't that bad, you're probably fine.
Yeah.
Like people read the headline and the first paragraph. If it's something buried in there, like it's so ephemeral, you'll probably worry about it more than it's actually a problem.
Differentiating yourself in a crowded marketplace. I feel like the inside might be a good example of this.
Yeah.
A lot of furniture coming out right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, we get that question all like, well, you're a D2C furniture company. How are you different? And I think that's where the founding story comes into play a lot, because you can tell a story that really resonates. So, for instance, one of our co-founders was on the executive team at Wayfair. So like she saw firsthand, she was in Asia, where she would see these furniture manufacturing plants, and she tells this really visceral kind of really visual story where she was at one of them, and it was like she calls it like this existential sad like warehouse, where it was just like full of rugs that were never going to be sold and that were just probably going to be dumped in a landfill. And then at the back of the warehouse where they were manufacturing, there was purple textile dye that was just being shot out into the river outside that was then feeding downstream like the farmers' crops. And like that is something that will stick with you guys, and that you'll be like, oh wow, like I'll remember that. And so like that's kind of those anecdotes are, they don't remember what you did or what you said, they remember how they made you feel. So thinking about like what emotions you want to elicit in somebody and using that as your way in. And so that then is one of our founding principles, which is being, inherently more sustainable option, very much so. And so that's kind of how we thought about differentiating ourselves, is like really using kind of the personalities behind it to tell that story. Because at the end of the day, I could sit here and be like, well, you can personalize all our frames across 1,000 plus or 100 plus fabrics and blah, blah, blah. But like, you're not going to remember any of that at the end of the day if you're not in the market to buy, a couch. So really you have to think about like what the underlying kind of emotions are behind it.
Mallory, Carolyn from TIA has spoken on a couple panels, and I know, and you had mentioned that they, I mean, do you have any, how did they go out? Because there are a lot of women's health clinics kind of launching lately. Was there anything special that you kind
You know
of
what's
honed
so
on there?
interesting about that one? We went so viral with this that it outsized the client's expectations, and there did end up being press coverage from one outlet known for being pretty snarky about how like they had tried to sign up for the user experience, and there was such a long wait list and so much demand as a result of all the coverage that they found difficulty in signing up for the process and were really disappointed in it. And so that was a case where like sometimes there is such a thing as like too much good PR. Like,
Because I am told that you can only launch once.
Yeah. So that one
you're in
was really
beta.
interesting, but I think it's the same thing too of like capturing the zeitgeist or thinking about what's happening in culture and how does this actually fill a true need. Very similar to the role model as well of like what's something that's happening, what's a problem that we're trying to solve, what's the data we have to back it up, what's the expertise that we have on staff that other people might not, that we can provide this unique value. But I will say by and large, like at the end of the day, you're going to have competitors. You may very well have like some kind of edge on your product, but maybe they have an edge on their product somewhere else. And so much of this has to do with like, how can you disrupt the product rationale through an emotional benefit for the consumer? And my best example of this is from as of late is if you're familiar with the brand Billy, which is razors for womankind, and a body brand. We launched them and we really thought critically, and we still work with them now and are scaling them as a very fast-growing company, thinking about what makes this more than a razor, because the founder was so passionate about disrupting the pink tax, which is the tax often put on women's products simply for being marketed to women. So women's razors and the personal care in general is the category that is the most guilty of this behavior, and razors out of all of personal care are the most. So you'll pay several dollars more for a women's razor than a men's, even though they might both have 5 blades that are made by the same manufacturer. It's just because one's pink. So her thing was like affordable pricing. And really, when you extract that, the emotional benefit is being female first. Like we are a by women for women personal care brand that makes these body and razor products. So we actually launched with this cheeky rebate program where we said, well, actually, when you refer friends, we are comping you back a rebate for the pink tax that you've spent on our competitors. And so that was something that had emotional value that people really got behind and shared. We were also the first ever women's shave brand in history to show female body hair in shaving ads, which sounds crazy,
Wow.
but it also, yeah, thanks.
That's crazy.
I couldn't even tell where that came from. It was like the wow of God.
Yeah.
But yeah, being able to tell an emotional story and then be able to say like, hey, this is how we're female first. This is why we're a better shave brand than the competitors, because we're on your side and we're showing real women and normalizing conversations around body hair.
Budgeting in the early days. We have a lot of people in here are seed stage. So a little money, not a lot, but I think there are a lot of people in here with close to no money. So is there anything that they can do that moves the needle?
I feel like as the first employee, that's your question.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like if it doesn't make sense to invest in PR, I think there's a lot of ways to DIY it. It's just you really have to invest time into it. It's not like, oh, I wrote an email, I'm going to send it out and expect results.
Yeah.
So you really have to think of a trick that I use when I joined Row and I want to go out to all these health reporters I'd never worked with before. And again, like I'm in the PR world, so like a little bit of a network. I reached out to my friends who knew reporters at publications that I wanted to get in touch with. And I used their name in my subject line. I'd be like, recommendation from this person with like 2 lines about my pitch. And even though they didn't know me and they didn't know our company, they knew that name. It was familiar to them. So they at least like opened it, gave it a shot. So like use your network. If you have a investor or someone that's connected, like use their name, you know?
Mallory.
This is my favorite question. So sorry, I just wanted to jump in.
Yeah.
I think it can be really fun when you have limited constraints to think really creatively and out of the box. And I'm a huge fan of stunts, and stunts do not cost money half the time. So a good example of this is one of our really early clients. This is just an example of like, I'll use small girls for these two examples. One of our really early clients hired us to do their social media and get attention for their blog. And we were like, what's an interesting way to do that? And we were like kind of in a rut, and we were like, you know what? What if we just wore a prom dress every single day and live blog that experience? Like, what would that be like? That would be really interesting. People would want to follow that, right? And like, granted, like if you were the prom dress company, you could be like, I'm eating the dog food. Like that could be a headline. Like this founder is wearing a prom dress every day for 30 days in order to test the efficacy of their product or whatever it might be. Or like lives life like it's prom every day to really get into the mind of their consumer. But granted, like we did that. We didn't pitch any press for it because at the time that's not what we did as a company. It's not how we started. And the Today Show reached out, and we were the homepage of Glamour, and we were in Elle magazine and all of these things. And so all of a sudden this client got huge value add. Press wasn't even part of the scope. And that's something that like you as a founder could have done for free, is like thinking a little bit outside of the box. And recently we were really struggling to make a key hire. And I was like, I want press for this. And like, I want to get attention on this hire, but I don't want to spend budget on it. So we decided to make t-shirts for the dogs in our office and t-shirts for dogs at a local animal shelter that said, career support animal, small girls PR is hiring. And this cost like $10 a shirt. So we're talking like 20 shirts. This is like very low budget. And we just had people walking these dogs around the city. And granted, like that's like not the most targeted approach, but we literally sent a 2-line email to PR Week, and they did a full feature on it that then got picked up. So I think that's a really good example of like, you can think of PR as an out-of-the-box solution. You don't have to spend that much money or have a huge budget to do it. You just have to be creative.
You're exceptionally good at this. What? But how often? It seems like it's not often that founders or founding teams can do this. What is it about being separate from the company? Like, why is it that people often don't do this on their own? Like, is there something that, you know, a skill a PR person has or a creativity you have with a distance from the company? I'm just curious if you have any.
I think it is helpful to have an interdisciplinary approach. So like if you are running a food business, being able to be aware of what's happening in the fashion world and see like how you can plug in as a food business into fashion and then get coverage in like Harper's Bazaar and Marie Claire and Refinery 29 and their fashion vertical and things like that. And I think that's what makes for some really great and exciting PR and breaking through to new audiences. And so I think, you know, I have an advantage of being able to sit over 50 different brands and go from one brainstorm to the next and like learn something about stuff we've talked here. Like we were at Modsy, so I'll be talking about interior design in one meeting, and then I'll run into a DoorDash meeting and all of a sudden be talking about on-demand delivery and like what's happening in the political landscape with that. And so being able to gear shift, I guess. And then I think as a founder, which I've also been that, I am that too, being able to think about like, okay, if I'm spending all day, every day, thinking about opening my restaurant or running my restaurant, like your break can be reading the fashion magazine, but then being able to say like, okay, now that I had this fun break, what can I take that I learned from this article or from watching that movie and apply it to my business? Because that's where these stunt ideas come from. It's like putting two things together that have never been thought about before.
You're basically saying always be working.
Yeah, well, that's how I live my life. It's probably not the recommended approach, actually. So yeah, next.
On the budget note, one quick question. I think everyone mentioned you kind of have to, you get what you pay for. What is kind of the minimum that you really think that someone can be paying and be getting a decent product?
For PR.
For
like
PR.
I mean, it depends. Like we worked, when I joined, we just hired a freelancer. And so that was somebody who came from now $1 billion D2C company. And he was one of the first PR hires and he just wanted to do his own thing. And we were kind of, vote his first client. So that we obviously did not pay as much as we would if he had his own agency with,
Yeah.
a roster of clients. So that was kind of like a hack around just working with an agency. But again, like that's one person. He doesn't have the resources of a team. He doesn't have necessarily like the access to muck rack, incision, and all these tools. And so you could pay somebody like that, like, I don't know, a couple grand a month, or you could even pay them on a project basis, like for a launch. I think it's best really, I mean, and I'm sure you guys would agree, like to really see results and task an agency with just working with you for a month, like it's really hard. It takes some time, but like if you're working with a bigger agency, like you're not going to be spending less than, a lot of times $10,000 to $15,000 a month. So you really need to think about where your resources are best laid out, especially in the beginning when you're just trying to figure it all out.
Thank you. Big topic, little time, influencers. Yay, yay, yay.
Yeah, so we started more as like I mentioned social media and like running a prom blog. We started more on the influencer marketing and social media and experiential realm, and then branched out to do more press and brand messaging and strategy. So we still have influencer marketing as a huge part of our business. We just used to call it downtown cool kid tastemaker marketing before influencer marketing was a term. I'm a huge believer in it. I think that it's an interesting territory that kind of brings us full circle to the beginning of the chat about PR versus marketing. Influencer work can be earned or paid. And so earned is typically what you think of when you think of PR, and marketing is typically paid and performance-based. So you're looking at CPM and the add to cart rates and things like that. And you can get more measurement than out of typical like an earned Forbes placement, where you're not able to really know like who actually came from Forbes versus New York Post 100% of the time if people are thinking about it later. With influencers, I would say finding people who are really authentic to the story or greater emotional narrative of your brand, rather than just taking like a surface level beautiful photo of your product. Obviously, if you're an app or a platform or an e-commerce company, being really creative with how you work with influencers, so it's not just like they show a product that's on your e-commerce site, but then aren't speaking to the tenets of why we rep Moda Operandi. So why Moda Operandi over Shopbop, for example. Being really sensitive about that. So like, what is your story? How are you seeding that to influencers? One hot tip, there's a new trend with influencer marketing of influencers just being really tired of receiving packages unwarranted that have like packing peanuts and just a less sustainable approach. So reaching out first and confirming they'd even be interested in the product before mailing it to them.
And I think also just, knowing that just because you're working with an influencer who has 500,000 followers, that's not necessarily better than working with an influencer who has 10,000 followers who are all hyper engaged, because you also can't tell, how many of those 500,000 followers are real, how many are actually following and engaging with this person's content. Consumers are we all probably have seen sponsored posts, and you can really tell like what's real and what's authentic and what the person believes in versus what's not. So don't necessarily just think that like my influencer strategy has to be working with these macro like 100,000 plus kind of like big name influencers. You can have a very successful micro influencer program where you're working with people with like 10,000 followers, and that's a really good testing ground for you. It's going to be a lot cheaper if you take a paid approach. They're more likely to just promote product versus charging per post. So there's a lot of different ways to think about influencer. It doesn't just need to be like what we're thinking about, what a lot of people think is influencer, which is like Kim Kardashian, who's charging like a couple $100,000 per post. So I would think about what really makes the most sense for your business.
And we have 2 B2C brands. What about B2B? Is it all the same framework and philosophies for PR?
I haven't done B2B in a very long time. So I think it's different in the sense that it's often more trade associated, where you have to really dive deep into a practice and be working with journals and industry analysts and things of that nature. There's definitely much less editorial space dedicated to it since the audiences are more narrow. I also think from a pay scale perspective, actually spending on a B2B agency is often slightly higher than spending on a B2C agency or a generalist agency. So that's something just to keep in consideration when you're thinking about it. I do think there's something called B2e storytelling you can do, which is figure out how does my B2B business relate somehow to what's happening in pop culture or consumers' lives and be able to tell a story that's rich for a refinery 29 that might be unexpected and still, people of every industry are reading consumer outlets. We're all consumers.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In my previous agency, I led the team for Deloitte, and that's like the epitome of a B2B business. And a lot of what were doing was not relevant to like a consumer audience. But at the end of the day, we had to remember that the people we were targeting, to Mallory's point, they were consumers as well. So the person who, was, the key decision maker at like AT&T, who maybe, was a prospect, and making that up, but like that person was also reading the same news that we're reading in our downtime. So you can't discount that. It's not that you just need to go after trade. Yes, that's certainly, a focus, but like that person's also reading the Wall Street Journal, and they're also, reading blogs. And so you have to think about them as a person rather than as like, this kind of like corporate entity.
Thank you, Lindsay, Mallory, Michelle. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your questions. Thank you to AWS, and please check out Indeed.